Hello there. This is part 2 to my previous video, Genetic Betrayal, The Truth About Race. I recommend you go and watch that first, or at least see the introduction, as the video is timestamped. In case you'd rather just jump into this video though, this is the piece of race realist nonsense we're debunking. We finished with the first 4 quote-unquote myths last time, and now we'll continue with myth number 5 till the end. Myth number 5. Racial differences in intelligence are explained by socioeconomic factors. Finally, a favorite topic of racists that have never accomplished anything in their lives: African Americans and intelligence. Honestly, I've always wondered, if the race realist that made this is truly so superior to everyone else, why does he even bother? Why doesn't he just go on about his life, being superior and all that? Go out, get a dog, go find love. I promise you, it's better than sitting in a dark room on IamAracist.com forums, circle jerking about how superior they are. You don't see black people doing this. Anyways, what they're trying to say here is that basically intelligence, or the supposed gap between blacks and whites, is purely racial. There's a lot of bad research here, so strap in. There's a lot of talk about IQ, and, well, let's just grant the usual perception of usefulness of IQ. Just know that its usefulness is contested, and that research into intelligence is very nuanced and multifaceted. Of course, you won't get that perspective from the race realists. Of course, environment affects, well, practically everything about a person's development. One thing that's rarely mentioned, though, is the role of epigenetics. Epigenetics shows that the effect of stress can persist onto your children and further descendants. Now, remember that African Americans in the US were subject to forcible removal from their homes, the transatlantic slave trade, centuries of unimaginable oppression and slavery, decades of further disgusting racism and discrimination after emancipation, and I use that term loosely, just to name a few. On top of all this, there are centuries of being forced to live the most pathetic existence, never-ending malnutrition, no access, or actually the complete exclusion from, any form of educational institute or academic endeavor, segregation, torture, extreme poverty, constant fearing for one's life, the most inhumane existence for a population wronged for hundreds upon hundreds of years that in parts of the US still continues to this day. And these race realists dare say that a fault a black person may have, no matter how minute, is by fault of their genetics and their skin color, not their environment. Alright, let's cover something quick. Here at the bottom right, you see a graph from the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. Basically, the study examined the IQ test scores of adopted children of different races and of non-adopted white children, all of whom were raised by white families. As you may imagine, the study supposedly found higher IQs for the white adoptees compared to the black adoptees. If this study did indeed equalize the environments for blacks and whites, then the results would seem to indicate that the IQ gap is largely genetic. However, there are 2 reasons to doubt that the study equalized the environments for blacks and whites. Number 1, the children with 2 black parents were adopted substantially later than other children. The average white child was adopted about 19 months, but the average child with 2 black parents was adopted at 32 months. The results of the study showed that the children who were adopted later had much lower IQs than those who were adopted earlier. Black children adopted within 1 year of birth had IQs 7 points higher than those adopted later, for example. Secondly, while the study did somewhat equalize environments after adoption, they failed to equalize environments before adoption. This can be extremely important as well. For example, a high blood lead level in infants can result in a noticeable reduction in IQ during adulthood. Blood lead level is particularly important for the blacks in the study because when this study was published in the 1970s, the blood lead level of black children aged 6 months to 5 years was extremely higher than the level for white children of the same age. Thus, lead could have played a significant role in the black children's IQ. Blood lead level is just one example, by the way. Factors such as social stimulation before adoption are also important to a child's cognitive development, but the study could not have equalized such factors. Many other studies, by the way, have shown results that contradict this one as well. Now, almost all the rest of the graphs you see have to do with comparisons of income brackets, race, and test scores. The claim being that even African Americans from higher income families score worse than white Americans from lower income families, and that this is supposedly explained by race, not environment. Of course, they're wrong. Before I say why, though, notice that one of the graphs is from the bell curve by Charles Murray. Famous for all sorts of blacks are inferior nonsense, I'll spare you my personal opinions of this person, who has no qualifications in genetics, mind you. Instead, I suggest you watch the video Reading the Right, Volume 1, The Bell Curve, to get a far better breakdown than I can give in this already bloated series of videos. They also cite Arthur Jensen, an author that received over $1 million from the Pioneer Fund, a foundation founded by a Nazi fellow traveler and is noted for supporting white supremacist goals. I'm sure there is no conflict of interest there at all. Definitely no ideological motive either. Just pure science. Yes. Now, I'm not all too interested in SAT scoring, as academic test scores are definitely not a measure of intelligence. Anyone who's ever gone through any sort of standardized testing can admit to that. Nor do I care that within quote-unquote racial groupings there are larger discrepancies in test scores than between racial groupings, something they conveniently don't mention. The entire question is misguided because we're letting the race realists frame the question, when we've already seen that they aren't honest with, well, anything. This isn't different here. Just because a black family has been in a higher income bracket for a generation or two doesn't mean that every other environmental factor changes with it. Income is only one environmental factor. Unlike what the copypasta claims, not all factors were equalized, and the results don't show that it's genetic. I wrote in my script that I should give an analogy here, but I don't know which is more appropriate, so I'll just give both. Imagine two fields for agriculture. One perpetually underwater, horribly mistreated and unkept for 300 years, and one that's been growing stuff regularly and more or less maintained, at least a little bit, for the same amount of time. Now, let's say the flooded and unkempt field is recently deflooded and someone starts somewhat taking care of it. Will it grow stuff immediately at the same rate and amount as the other field? No, of course not. Another analogy is two trees, one in a very unfavorable environment and one in an alright one, let's say. Let's say we finally bring the trees to the same level. Will the previously disadvantaged tree immediately start bearing fruit? No, of course not. It will need a few seasons, if not many years, to heal and improve its condition before it'll do anything. The latter example I've seen in real life, so that's why I decided to include both. The race realists ignore many things. They ignore that the IQ gap stopped closing when Reagan intensified the war on drugs, with the admitted intention of targeting African Americans. They ignore economic inequality, stereotyping, and we'll get back to that in a second, the blood lead level and its effect on cognitive development, the stress of living with a different skin color that carries with it the fear of racist cops profiling and possibly murdering you on the street just for being that certain color. African Americans are to a large extent more affected by these factors than whites. The fact that the gap was closing at all until the drug war period is proof enough that environmental and educational improvements facilitated the ability and will to perform on arbitrary intelligence tests that don't prove anyone is any fundamentally more or less equal than anyone else. The race realists even conceded this point, as they now have retreated from all blacks are just stupid to a vaguer position of, well, poorer blacks still don't do as well as poorer whites. Something else that these race realists seem to not understand is spotlight anxiety and the extremely negative effects on performance that stereotyping has. A growing body of studies undercuts conventional assumptions that genetics or cultural differences lead some students, such as African Americans or girls, to do poorly on standardized academic tests and other academic performances. Instead, it's become clear that negative stereotypes raise inhibiting doubts and high-pressure anxieties in a test taker's mind, resulting in the phenomenon of stereotype threat. Psychologists Claude Steele, Joshua Aronson, and Stephen Spencer, all PhDs, have found that even passing reminders that someone belongs to one group or another, such as a group stereotyped as inferior in academics, can wreak havoc with test performance. Remember, Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panthers and, if you've read his writings, an obviously very intelligent man, couldn't read until 16 years of age due to the American school system. Neglect from the powers that be doesn't equate to inferiority. Honestly, this is the crux of the matter. When true scientists actually set their minds to figure out why something happens and actually attempt to improve human life, they come across real reasons for discrepancies that can be fixed. Just a note on the side, another person that is usually linked together with the blacks and IQ nonsense, not particularly in this copypasta, but some of the sources they cite him, is the work of Richard Lynn, which has been thoroughly discredited. Moving on, this hatred isn't new, it's historical, and it was applied to white people once as well. When the children of southern Italian immigrants were given IQ tests in the early part of the past century, for example, they recorded median scores in the high 70s and low 80s, a full standard deviation before their American and Western European counterparts. Southern Italians did as poorly on IQ tests as Hispanics and blacks did. As you can imagine, there was a lot of concerned talk at the time about the genetic inferiority of Italians, of the inadvisability of letting so many second-class immigrants into the United States, and of the squalor that seemed endemic to Italian urban neighborhoods. Does any of this sound familiar? Nowadays, though, the discussion about Southern Italians has entirely disappeared. The psychologists Seymour Saracen and John Doris ask, in their account of the Italian experience, did their genes begin to mutate somewhere in the 1930s? Or is it possible that somewhere in the 1920s, if not earlier, the sociocultural history of Italo-Americans took a turn from the blacks and the Spanish Americans, which permitted their assimilation into the general undifferentiated mass of Americans? Final point. This is all theater. All these arguments and discussions don't matter, as this is nothing but a political project for these race realists. Something that annoys me is that they'll say all of this about blacks, but then feign objectivity. The latest trend is to be an absolute racist cunt, but then say that Asians are smarter than whites, or that blacks are better athletes. But if you were to, in turn, say, well then, Asians are clearly the superior race, based on IQ, the criteria you use to establish your supposed superiority over blacks, they'll quickly back down with excuses. Look, if Asians are smarter, blacks stronger, and Jews supposedly control everything, then are whites really superior? Myth number 6. There isn't significant genetic distance between races. Now, it's probably obvious to you that letting the race realists dictate the term of the debate is silly because they've shown themselves to be intellectually dishonest. Here is yet another example of this. The claim is that Africans are cleanly separated from the rest of humanity, and that if we applied the same taxonomic standards that we use on animals instead on humans, we'll have numerous human subspecies. Immediately, we could point out that subspecies do not necessarily mean races, unless that's what they're trying to say. If so, they're wrong. I mean, they're wrong nonetheless, but they're still wrong. Here is yet another telling example of their strategy where these race realists, who have no idea what they're talking about, start applying the layman definition onto a scientific term in hopes of finding someone not discerning enough to fall into their trap. The term subspecies, although very clear in layman terms, isn't as clear in the scientific community. There isn't a single unified definition of what exactly a subspecies is, nor is it a universally accepted term, and most relevant fields don't make much use of the concept. Now, the first little table is supposed to lend credibility to the claim, if jaguars have as much genetic variability as humans, and they have 9 subspecies, then how many subspecies do humans have? Except there is a lot of doubt about these animals, for example jaguars, having subspecies at all. The animal they cite with supposedly as much genetic diversity between humans as between members of its own species, jaguars, is now actually believed to not have any subspecies at all. Outdated research from a century ago believed that there were 9 subspecies. This was revised to 3, and now we stand at 0. In 1939, Reginald Innes Pocock, unfortunate name, recognized 8 subspecies based on geographic origins and skull morphology of these specimens. Later considerations of this work suggested only 3 subspecies should be recognized. Results of morphologic and genetic research indicate a clinal north-south variation between populations, but no evidence for subspecies differentiation. The IUCN Red List assessors for the species and members of the cat specialist group do not recognize any jaguar subspecies as valid. To further drive this point home, in a 2004 study, Ryan Zink used the small amounts of genetic variation and population structure in bird species to challenge nearly 97% of claimed temperate bird subspecies that he investigated, even though many of them showed some level of non-random genetic variation. Primate taxonomy has also experienced a major drop in subspecies and an increase in identified species based on new data and a more robust concept of species that aims to identify independent evolutionary lineages as the smallest unit in taxonomy. The second graph is basically myth number 1 all over again. Interestingly, citing this study here in myth number 6 disproves myth number 4, because the study cited says that African populations have the highest amount of genetic diversity. It also says that when you include large samples of all groups of people, because, humanity doesn't exist in a vacuum, population differentiation drops. It also says that different African populations can be clearly separated into distinct groups, basically flying in the face of the claim that there is a single African or black race. Well done, guys. Really, really worked hard to ensure you have no conflicting studies. It's honestly hilarious how they pick and choose what to believe and ignore whatever conflicts with their worldview from the very studies they cite. It's almost as if they're ideologues with no respect for the scientific work they claim to be championing. Myth number 7. There isn't qualitative genetic evidence for racial differences. Basically a rehashing of myth number 3 and 5, but with even more examples showing that these race realists don't know what they're talking about. Yet another example of the information dump technique, where they basically try to overwhelm you with a lot of studies about things you won't know about unless you're within those respective fields or are very into this kind of specialist literature. Either way, it doesn't matter because a single gene being more common, for example Central Asian populations, doesn't mean that races exist. Sadly, I don't think the typical race realist understands the jump that has to be made in order to draw that conclusion. Hold on. I see an interesting name here. Volker Weiss. Where have I heard that name before? Oh, could it be the editor of Mankind Quarterly, a racist rag masquerading as a scientific journal? The same guy that wrote a novel-length fanfiction about Nazi Germany continuing into the 21st century? Could it be that guy? Oh yeah, it is that guy. Oh, and what about this? Davide Pfeiffer? Another quack that not only publishes in Mankind Quarterly, but also, due to his shoddy work being constantly refused by actually reputable journals after being reviewed, started his own bullshit journal called Open Psych, which publishes more pseudoscientific nonsense and goes completely unrecognized. He also publishes in Intelligence, a journal that has the aforementioned long-since disgraced race realist Richard Lynn on its editorial board. Not only this, but Pfeiffer is also a research fellow of the Ulster Institute for Social Research, a racist institute, if it's just a website really, there's no institute, founded by that very same Richard Lynn, and publishes, you guessed it, more racist pseudoscience. Oh, and what's this? The just mentioned journal Intelligence makes a showing. Makes you really think, huh? The way they solely rely on discredited and untrustworthy sources in this section. By the way, the findings of this particular study, that a certain marker is associated with higher IQ populations and is more common in Europeans, has been proven to be false. Further research has shown that it is not, in fact, associated with intelligence, but I digress. As for Mankind Quarterly, for those that don't know, it's part of the disgraced Richard Lynn's Ulster Institute, which receives funding from the Pioneer Fund I mentioned earlier. The Pioneer Fund is a white nationalist organization and is on the Southern Poverty Law Center's watch list. Mankind Quarterly is headed by Lynn, who no academic takes seriously because his research is, to use the technical term, shit. Here is a great peer-reviewed article about just how shit his methodology and analysis are, and here you can read their response to Lynn's sad attempt to defend himself. For fun, let's just quote a little bit. This suggests that Lynn and Meisenberg excluded samples of Africans who averaged IQs above 75 because they deemed these samples unrepresentative on the basis of the sample's relatively high IQs. We conclude that Lynn and Meisenberg's unsystemic methods are questionable and their results untrustworthy. The majority of studies on IQ test performance of Africans not taken into account by Lynn and Van Hanen and Malloy showed considerably higher average IQs than the studies that they did review. We judge the reviews of Lynn and Van Hanen and Malloy to be unsystematic. These authors missed a large part of the literature on IQ testing in Africa, failed to explicate their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and made downward errors in the conversion of raw scores to IQ. Lynn and Van Hanen's estimates of average IQs of Africans of around 67 is untenable. Our review indicates that it is about 78, which is UK norms, or 80, US norms. But, I hear some race realists claim, Mankind Quarterly is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Except it's not. It's none of those things. Anyone can start a journal, and the editors can pick the peer reviewers. Add this with an agenda, and you can mass-produce quote-unquote peer-reviewed garbage. There's a reason Mankind Quarterly has a horrible reputation, as it should. It's funded by white supremacists, was founded by a Nazi, had on its board Corrado Gini, who worked as Mussolini's scientific advisor, and has numerous instances of blatant, dehumanizing racism mixed with praise for this or that KKK member. It is a joke, and this is one of the sources they're proud of. Just imagine the others. As for this study, single nucleotide polymorphism in the neuroplastin locus associates with cortical thickness and intellectual ability in adolescence. It's actually a legitimate piece of work from a reputable source. However, notice how in all the other blurbs they put little quotations from the articles, but they didn't here. Why? Because, unlike the people that made this copypasta, the authors of the study shy away from making any definitive statements about intelligence, especially when we're discussing a polymorphism that cannot be used as a predictive marker for intelligence. They make it very clear that this isn't what they were trying to show, nor is it what the results of the study show. Also, the next little bit, about common variants being more common in Eurasians, is absolutely made up. The study doesn't mention race, or Europe, Eurasia, or Africa at all. In fact, this bit is ripped from another study completely, where they explicitly say both RS9915547 and RS4273712, basically, in layman terms, the stuff in question, were not associated with brain volume in our data, meaning it only correlated with intracranial volume, not the actual brain size. They further state, although it used to be believed that these were near exclusive in the Caucasian population, more recent research casts doubt on that too. Fantastic, you get an A for citing your sources, and an A+ for the dishonesty. I would have liked to check the other little quotation blurbs to see if they're being dishonest there as well, but honestly I'm tired of this now, and probability-wise they probably are. Finally, the last text blurb has nothing to say about race at all. I'm assuming the road they take with this is that since they think populations outside of Africa have more Neanderthal DNA, this is already not entirely correct, and since there's a hypothesis that the H2 haplotype of the MAP tau may have come from Neanderthals, and since Roger Penrose, someone completely unqualified in neuroscience, proposes that consciousness supposedly arises in MAP tau, that Africans are less conscious and hence less human? I don't know. Either that or they just wanted 4 on each side. Who knew racists loved symmetry? Something these race realists probably didn't know is that tau protein is associated with Alzheimer's disease, progressive supranuclear palsy, Pick's disease, and other tauopathies, which are incredibly debilitating diseases. As someone in the medical field, I'm surprised to see them mentioning tau at all, to be honest. The race realists would never want to even imply that white people get, for example, Alzheimer's more frequently. That wouldn't be very superior of them, now would it? Unless, of course, the race realists have no idea what they're talking about and are too blinded by ideology to do their research properly. I think it's that. Finally, the last myth, myth number 9. Individual successes disprove the relevance of race. A strange argument to make, really. I've never heard anyone say this, but let's say what the copypasta says. Scientific studies show European admixture is an excellent predictor of how successful a black person is. Wow, now already this is so fucking stupid that I can't believe they kept it in. First of all, they need to learn basic arithmetic, as only one study is cited, not studies. Secondly, they're trying to say with that little graph to the left that 2.4% more European ancestry is the difference between a bachelor's degree and a high school degree. Not only that, but that 2.4% is supposed to account for being wealthier, having a better job, being more educated overall, etc., etc. Now bear with me, if a 2.4% increase in European admixture, whatever that means, is an excellent predictor of black success, then why are there poor whites at all? Or uneducated whites? 5% supposedly stands between dropping out of high school and a bachelor's degree. If this was the eternal truth they're trying to present it as, then those would say 50% European admixture must be geniuses. Those with 95 or 99% European admixture must be mega galaxy-brained individuals then, right? No, of course not. Also, it's incredibly dishonest to cite this study, as it has nothing to do with measuring European admixture, again, whatever that means, and how well off one is. It actually measures factors influencing type 2 diabetes. To infer such silly nonsense from a study on a completely differing subject matter not only shows a complete disregard for the scientific process, but also shows how these people don't understand even basic analytical thinking. This is definitely one of those cases where correlation, and especially weak one mind you, definitely does not mean causation. Also, the fact that they thought this was a worthy argument in the copypasta they're so proud of really does all the debunking you need. They genuinely thought this was some earth-shattering truth. Jesus Christ, how fucking pea-brained can somebody be? Conclusion. I want to say that we're finally done. But we're never done. No matter how much we refute their arguments, they'll still retreat to another position, with another flimsy argument, because as we've already seen, these people aren't honest. They aren't doing this because they respect science or want the truth about anything. They formed wrong political opinions based on garbage, long-disproven conspiracy theories like white genocide, and then tried to prove their position correct by twisting medical research into saying what they wanted to say. They try to appeal to laymen with their propaganda despite the extremely complex science they incorrectly cite. They love avoiding to define terms, obfuscating the full scholarly debate over differing terminology, and try to make it look like there is a scientific consensus on the shit they peddle. Join me for the next and final part of this little series where I'll show the consequences of such theories and how they've played out in history before.